Maggie Foster felt the whispers behind her back long before she heard them, like tiny needles pricking at her skin as she walked down the dusty main street of San Antonio, Texas, in the spring of 1878. The townsfolk barely tried to hide their stares anymore the way their eyes lingered on her large frame as she made her way to the general store where she worked 6 days a week. "There goes Big Maggie," someone muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Maggie lifted her chin and continued walking, her heart hammering against her ribs. At 26, she had grown accustomed to the cruel remarks about her size, but familiarity never dulled their sting. She smoothed down her modest calico dress, specially sewn to accommodate her generous figure, and tried to focus on the tasks that awaited her at Hopkins' General Store. The bell jingled as she pushed open the door, and Mr. Hopkins glanced up from behind the counter. "Morning, Maggie." "You're right on time as usual." "Good morning, Mr. Hopkins," she replied, grateful for his businesslike demeanor. In the 3 years she'd worked for him, he'd never once commented on her appearance, treating her with the same gruff courtesy he extended to everyone else. She tied her apron around her waist and set to work organizing the new shipment of dry goods that had arrived on yesterday's stage. The routine was comforting, counting inventory, arranging displays, helping customers find what they needed. Here, at least, she had purpose. The morning passed in a blur of activity. San Antonio was growing rapidly, and the store rarely had a quiet moment. Maggie was restocking the shelves with canned peaches when the bell above the door chimed again. She glanced up to see a stranger enter, a tall man with a weather-beaten face and broad shoulders, wearing trail-dusted clothes and a worn Stetson. The newcomer nodded politely to Mr. Hopkins before making his way around the store, gathering supplies. There was something deliberate in his movements, a careful precision that suggested he was a man who knew exactly what he needed. When he approached the counter to pay, Maggie couldn't help but notice his eyes a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "That'll be $3.45, Mr. Hopkins said after tallying the purchases. The stranger paid without haggling, which was unusual for most cowboys passing through. As Mr. Hopkins wrapped the items, the man turned slightly, and his gaze met Maggie's. She quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring, but not before she saw something unexpected in his expression, not the usual mockery or pity she was accustomed to from strangers, but a genuine, warm smile that reached those blue eyes. "Thank you kindly," he said to Mr. Hopkins, tipping his hat before gathering his purchases and heading for the door. Just before exiting, he paused and turned back. "Name's Xavier Cross, by the way. Just bought the old Donovan place out east of town. Might be seeing more of me." With that, he was gone, leaving Maggie with a peculiar fluttering sensation in her chest that she couldn't quite name. That evening, as Maggie closed up shop, Mr. Hopkins cleared his throat awkwardly. "Almost forgot this came for you earlier." He handed her a small bundle wrapped in a damp cloth. Puzzled, Maggie unwrapped it to find a small gathering of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, tied together with a simple piece of twine. "Who left these?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. No one had ever given her flowers before. Mr. Hopkins shrugged. "That new fella, Cross, said to make sure you got 'em before they wilted." Maggie stared at the wildflowers, their vibrant colors almost unreal against the plain cloth. "There must be some mistake," she said quietly. "No mistake. Asked for you by name." Mr. Hopkins busied himself with the ledger, clearly uncomfortable with the topic of flowers and sentiments. "Lock up when you leave, will you?" The walk home to her small, rented room above the millinery shop took longer than usual that evening. As Maggie's thoughts kept returning to the wildflowers clutched carefully in her hand, and the stranger with the kind eyes, her landlady, Mrs. Winters, raised an eyebrow at the sight of the flowers but said nothing as Maggie hurried up to her room. Once alone, she found a chipped teacup, filled it with water, and placed the wildflowers inside, positioning them on her windowsill where the evening light caught their colors. Maggie sat on the edge of her bed, wondering what could possibly have prompted such a gesture. In all her years, through all the towns she'd lived in following her parents' deaths, no man had ever shown her this kind of attention. Certainly none had ever given her flowers. Perhaps it was a cruel joke, she thought suddenly, her momentary happiness souring. It wouldn't be the first time someone had pretended interest only to publicly humiliate her later. The memory of Thomas Wilson back in Missouri still burned, how he'd courted her for weeks, only to announce to a crowded saloon that it had all been a wager to see if he could get the fat girl to believe someone could want her. She almost threw the flowers out the window then, but something stopped her. The stranger, Xavier Cross, hadn't seemed the type for such meanness. There had been something genuine in his smile, something that made her want to believe. Foolishness, she murmured to herself, turning away from the window. Pure foolishness. Yet when she fell asleep that night, her dreams were filled with wildflowers and blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when they smiled. The next morning, Maggie woke before dawn as she always did, dressed quickly and headed downstairs. Mrs. Winters was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for her boarders. "Morning, Maggie," the older woman said, sliding a plate of eggs and biscuits across the table. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Maggie lied, not wanting to admit how thoughts of a certain cowboy had kept her tossing and turning well into the night. She ate quickly, eager to get to work and lose herself in the day's tasks. As she stepped out onto the porch, she nearly tripped over something placed carefully by the door, another small bundle of wildflowers, fresher than yesterday's, with droplets of dew still clinging to the petals. Maggie looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of anyone. Whoever had left them must have come at first light. "Another admirer?" Mrs. Winters asked from behind her, a note of surprise in her voice. I'm not sure," Maggie admitted, bending to pick up the flowers. "Well, whoever he is, he's an early riser," the landlady observed, "and persistent." Maggie carried the flowers with her to the store, ignoring the curious glances from the few townsfolk already about their business. Mr. Hopkins raised an eyebrow when she entered with the second bouquet, but made no comment as she placed them in a jar of water near the window. The day passed slowly. Each time the bell over the door rang, Maggie's heart gave a little jump. But Xavier Cross did not return to the store, and by closing time, she had convinced herself that the flowers were merely a passing fancy, some odd cowboy custom she didn't understand. As she walked home in the fading light, her steps were heavy with disappointment she was reluctant to acknowledge. The next morning, there were more flowers waiting on the porch, and the morning after that, and the next. Each day, without fail, a fresh bundle of wildflowers appeared, sometimes at Mrs. Winters' boarding house, sometimes at the general store. Never with a note, never with any explanation. A week passed, and the people of San Antonio began to take notice. Maggie overheard whispers as she passed by the saloon, saw the knowing glances exchanged between the ladies at church on Sunday. "Who do you think is sweet on Big Maggie? Must be blind or desperate, or both." She kept her head high and pretended not to hear, but each night she arranged the day's flowers in her growing collection of makeshift vases, and wondered about the man who had started it all. On the morning of the 8th day, Maggie was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Xavier Cross sat atop a handsome chestnut gelding, raining in directly in front of her. In the clear light of day, she could see him more clearly than she had in the dim store, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had once been broken, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Miss Foster," he said, tipping his hat. "Beautiful morning." Maggie clutched the broom tightly, suddenly aware of every pound of her weight, every inch of her size. "Mr. Cross," she managed, "I thank you for the flowers." A smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes just as she remembered. "You're welcome. Found a nice patch of them growing wild near my property. Seemed a shame not to share their beauty." Maggie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's very kind of you, but—" "Why me?" Xavier dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post with deliberate care before turning to face her. "First time I walked into that store, you were the only person who didn't look at me like I was just another drifter passing through. You saw me." He shrugged, as if that explained everything. "Besides, a woman like you deserves flowers every day. A woman like me." Maggie echoed, unable to keep the defensive note from her voice. His expression grew serious. "Kind eyes, gentle hands, the way you helped that little boy reach the penny candy even though his mother was pulling him away from you like you had the plague." He stepped closer. "I see more than most folks bother to, Miss Foster." Maggie stared at him, speechless. She remembered that incident, how the child's mother had yanked him away, muttering something about not getting too close. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed. "Would you do me the honor of joining me for supper tomorrow evening?" Xavier asked, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of uncertainty that made him suddenly seem more human. "Nothing fancy, just a meal at the hotel restaurant." Everything in Maggie wanted to say yes, but years of caution held her back. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Is this some kind of joke? A bet with the boys at the saloon?" A flash of anger crossed Xavier's face, quickly controlled. "No, madam. I don't play games with people's feelings. Never have, never will." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking because I'd like to know you better. Simple as that." Maggie studied his face, searching for any sign of deceit. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Cross, supper tomorrow." The smile that lit up his face was like sunrise breaking over the hills. "I'll call for you at 6 if that suits." "It suits," she replied, hardly believing the words coming from her own mouth. As Xavier mounted his horse and rode away, Maggie became aware of Mr. Hopkins standing in the doorway of the store, watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. "So that's our mystery flower giver," he commented. "Interesting fellow. You know anything about him?" Maggie asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Hopkins scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Not much. Paid cash for the old Donovan place. Been fixing it up from what I hear. Keeps to himself mostly." He gave her a rare smile. "Seems to have good taste in shopgirls, though." Maggie blushed and hurried back to work, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. That night, she stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room, studying her reflection with critical eyes. Her brown hair was her best feature, thick and wavy, falling past her shoulders when freed from its practical bun. Her face was round but not unpleasant, with clear skin and expressive hazel eyes. But there was no denying her size, the fullness of her bosom, the width of her hips, the soft roundness of her arms. She had long ago accepted that she would never be considered beautiful by most people's standards. Her mother, before consumption took her, had always told Maggie that she had a lovely face and that someday a man would see past her size to the person beneath. But after years of sidelong glances and cruel remarks, that childhood hope had withered like flowers without water. Yet here was Xavier Cross, bringing her wildflowers every day, looking at her as if she were something precious. "Don't be a fool," she whispered to her reflection. "Don't you dare be a fool." But even as she spoke the warning, she couldn't help the small flame of hope that flickered to life in her heart. The next day dragged endlessly. Maggie dropped a jar of pickles, miscounted change twice, and nearly walked into a support beam while lost in thought. Mr. Hopkins finally took pity on her and sent her home an hour early. "Go make yourself presentable," he said gruffly. "And Maggie, that Cross fellow seems decent enough, but you be careful, you hear?" She nodded, touched by his concern. "I will, Mr. Hopkins, thank you." Back at the boarding house, Maggie took extra care with her appearance, washing her hair and pinning it up in a softer style than usual, leaving a few tendrils to frame her face. She put on her best dress, a deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes, and even dabbed a tiny bit of her precious rose water behind her ears. Mrs. Winters appeared in her doorway as Maggie was fastening a simple cameo at her throat, her mother's, one of the few things she had left of her. "My, don't you look lovely," the landlady said, her usual briskness softened by genuine admiration. "Your young man won't know what hit him." "He's not my young man," Maggie protested weakly. "The way he's been leaving flowers every morning, we'll see about that." Mrs. Winters handed her a small shawl. "Evenings still get cool, and Maggie, you deserve this. Remember that." At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. Maggie's heart hammered so hard she was sure it must be visible through her bodice as she descended the stairs. Mrs. Winters was already ushering Xavier Cross into the small parlor, offering him tea, which he politely declined. When he saw Maggie, he stood immediately, removing his hat. He had cleaned up as well, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing a clean white shirt and dark vest that showed off his broad shoulders. "Miss Foster," he said, his voice slightly husky, "you look beautiful." For once, Maggie believed the compliment was sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Cross. You're quite handsome yourself." He offered his arm, which she took after a moment's hesitation, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her fingertips. "Don't stay out too late," Mrs. Winters called after them, sounding for all the world like a concerned mother. The hotel restaurant was only a short walk away, but it gave Maggie time to feel the curious stares of townspeople as they passed. A well-dressed couple leaving the bank stopped mid-conversation to gape at them. Two cowboys lounging outside the saloon nudged each other and whispered something that made them both snicker. Maggie felt her confidence begin to crumble, but Xavier seemed not to notice the attention, or if he did, he paid it no mind. "Weather's turning fine," he commented, as casually as if they were old friends out for an evening stroll. "Spring's always been my favorite season, everything coming back to life after the winter." "Mine too," Maggie agreed, grateful for the mundane topic. "Though summer in Texas takes some getting used to." "You're not from here originally?" Xavier asked as they reached the hotel and he opened the door for her. "No, Missouri. Came here after my parents died. My aunt lived here, but she passed 2 years ago." Maggie didn't mention that Aunt Beatrice had barely tolerated her presence, making it clear that taking in her late sister's overweight daughter was a burden rather than a kindness. The hotel dining room was modestly elegant, with white tablecloths and actual glass oil lamps on each table. Heads turned as they were seated, and Maggie heard the unmistakable buzz of whispers. Xavier, however, focused entirely on her, as if they were the only people in the room. "I'm from Colorado myself," he said once they had ordered. "Worked cattle most of my life. Saved up enough to buy my own spread, but land prices up there got too steep. Heard Texas was the place to be." "And what brought you to San Antonio specifically?" Maggie asked, genuinely curious. A shadow crossed his face briefly. "Needed a change." "Sometimes a man has to leave the past behind to find a future." There was clearly more to that story, but Maggie didn't press. Everyone had things they preferred not to discuss with near strangers. Their food arrived tender beef steak for him, chicken and dumplings for her, and conversation flowed more easily than Maggie would have expected. Xavier told her about his plans for the Donovan place, how he wanted to raise horses as well as cattle. Maggie shared stories about the more colorful customers at the general store, and was delighted when her descriptions made him laugh out loud. By the time they were sharing a slice of apple pie, Maggie had almost forgotten about the other diners and their curious stares. Xavier Cross was surprisingly easy to talk to, a good listener who asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. "May I ask you something, Mr. Cross?" she said as they finished their coffee. "Xavier, please, and yes, you may ask me anything." Xavier then. His name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. "Why the flowers? Every day without fail. It's very sweet, but you want to know why," he finished when she trailed off. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "My mother once told me that if you find someone special, you should never let a day go by without showing them they matter. She loved wildflowers, said they were tougher and more honest than hothouse blooms." A half smile played at his lips. "When I saw you in the store that first day, something just clicked. I can't explain it better than that." "But you don't even know me," Maggie protested softly. "I'm learning," he countered. "And what I've learned so far I like very much." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, as if she were precious, desirable. As Xavier paid the bill and they prepared to leave, Maggie became aware again of the other diners watching them. One woman in particular, Eleanor Prescott, the banker's wife, was staring openly with an expression of disbelief bordering on disgust. Outside, the night air had indeed grown cool, and Maggie was grateful for her shawl. They walked slowly back toward Mrs. Winter's boarding house, neither seeming in a hurry to end the evening. "I had a lovely time," Maggie said as they reached the front porch. "Thank you." "The pleasure was mine," Xavier replied. He hesitated, then took her hand gently in his. "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me on a picnic this Sunday?" After church services, Maggie thought of the social implications. Being seen publicly with Xavier, not just once but twice, would set tongues wagging even more furiously. Yet the thought of spending another afternoon in his company made her heart race. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that very much." The smile that lit his face was worth any amount of gossip. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Until Sunday, then. And Maggie, thank you for taking a chance on me." As he walked away into the darkness, Maggie touched the spot on her hand where his lips had been, feeling as though something monumental had just occurred, as if her life had somehow shifted onto an entirely new path in the space of a single evening. True to his word, the next morning brought another bundle of wildflowers, this time with a small note. "Counting the hours until Sunday." Maggie tucked the note into her pocket, where she could touch it throughout the day, a tangible reminder that last night had not been a dream. At the store, Mr. Hopkins mercifully refrained from asking about her evening, though his knowing smile when she arrived humming to herself said everything. The customers, however, were less discreet. "Heard you had dinner with that new rancher last night, Mrs. Barton commented while Maggie measured out flour for her. "Quite the talk of the town." "Is that so?" Maggie replied neutrally. Indeed." Eleanor Prescott was quite beside herself. Mrs. Barton leaned closer. "Between you and me, I think it's wonderful. About time someone appreciated you properly." Surprised by the unexpected support, Maggie looked up from the flour. "Thank you, Mrs. Barton." The older woman patted her hand. "Not everyone in this town is small-minded, dear. Remember that. As the day progressed, Maggie discovered that Mrs. Barton was right while some customers eyed her speculatively or whispered behind their hands. Others offered genuine smiles and kind words. San Antonio, like any frontier town, had its share of gossips and judgmental souls, but it also had people who understood that happiness, wherever found, was too precious to condemn. Sunday arrived clear and warm, perfect weather for a picnic. Maggie wore a blue dress that she had secretly let out the previous year, but had never quite had the courage to wear in public. The color brought out the warmth in her complexion, and the style was more flattering to her figure than her usual severe cuts. Church services were an exercise in restraint as she felt the weight of curious gazes throughout the sermon. Reverend Matthew spoke about judgment and compassion, and Maggie wondered if he had somehow divined the whispers circulating among his congregation. Xavier sat several pews behind her, but she could feel his presence as surely as if he were beside her. When the service ended and the congregation filed out into the churchyard, he was waiting, hat in hand, looking so handsome in his Sunday best that Maggie's breath caught. "Miss Foster," he said, offering his arm. "Ready for our picnic?" Maggie took his arm, ignoring the stares. "More than ready, Mr. Cross." He had a wagon waiting, a picnic basket already loaded in the back alongside a folded blanket. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. They drove east out of town, following the meandering course of the San Antonio River. Spring had painted the landscape in vibrant colors: bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and black-eyed Susans carpeted the fields alongside the road. "This is where I find your flowers each morning," Xavier told her, gesturing to a particularly lush patch of wildflowers. "There seems to be an endless supply." "They're beautiful," Maggie said, touched by the thought of him rising early each day to pick fresh flowers for her. "No one's ever given me flowers before you." Xavier glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "That's hard to believe." "Not really," she replied, deciding honesty was best. "Men don't generally give flowers to women who look like me." He pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to face her fully. "And how exactly do you look, Maggie Foster?" She gestured vaguely at herself, suddenly uncomfortable. "You can see. I'm large." "Yes," he agreed matter-of-factly. "You're also beautiful, kind, intelligent, and possessed of a laugh that makes a man want to spend his life trying to hear it again." Maggie stared at him, speechless. "Where I come from," Xavier continued, his voice gentle but firm, "a woman is judged by her character, not her size. My mother was a big woman too, and my father worshipped the ground she walked on until the day he died." He picked up the reins again and clicked to the horses. "Anyone who can't see past appearances to the person beneath isn't worth your time or your tears, Maggie. Remember that." They continued on in silence for a while, Maggie processing his words. Finally, they reached a bend in the river where cottonwood trees provided dappled shade. Xavier helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. The picnic he had prepared was simple but thoughtful: fried chicken, corn bread, early spring berries, and a jar of lemonade. They spread the blanket in the shade and sat down to eat, the burble of the river providing a soothing backdrop. "Tell me about your family," Maggie said as they enjoyed the meal. "You mentioned your mother." Xavier nodded, his expression softening with memory. "She was amazing, tough as nails but gentle-hearted. Could shoot a rifle as well as any man and still make the lightest biscuits you ever tasted." He smiled. "Pa was a dreamer, always chasing the next big strike. Never found it, but he never stopped believing tomorrow would bring something better." "They sound wonderful," Maggie said, thinking of her own parents, her father's quiet strength, her mother's unwavering faith that things would work out. They were. A shadow crossed his face. Lost them both in a flash flood 5 years ago. They'd gone into town for supplies when the creek rose unexpectedly. By the time anyone realized they were missing, it was too late. "I'm so sorry," Maggie said softly, resisting the urge to reach for his hand. "Losing parents, it leaves a hole nothing else quite fills." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your folks, you mentioned they passed. Consumption took Ma first, then Pa a year later. Some said it was the disease, but I always thought it was a broken heart that really killed him." Maggie picked at a blade of grass. "They were good people. Never made me feel like I was less because I wasn't slim and pretty like the other girls." "You are pretty," Xavier said with such conviction that Maggie actually believed him for a moment. "Different from some, yes, but there's more than one kind of beauty in this world." They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their disappointments. Xavier told her about his time working cattle drives, the year he tried his hand at mining, how he'd finally saved enough to buy his own land. Maggie shared her dreams of someday opening a bookshop, her love of poetry, how she taught herself to sew because no ready-made clothes ever fit properly. The sun was beginning its western descent when Xavier finally stood and offered his hand to help her up. "I should get you back," he said reluctantly, "though I'd happily spend the rest of the day right here." As they packed up the remains of their picnic, Maggie felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. There was something about Xavier Cross that made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had, as if he truly valued the person she was beneath her size. The drive back to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought. As they approached San Antonio, Maggie became aware again of the world beyond their private bubble, the town with its judgments and expectations, the life she had carefully constructed for herself. "Xavier," she said suddenly, "what are we doing?" He glanced at her, brows drawn together in confusion. "Heading back to town." "No, I mean, this," she gestured between them. "The flowers, the dinner today. What is this?" Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop on the outskirts of town, turning to face her fully. "This is me courting you, Maggie Foster, properly, respectfully, with honorable intentions, if you'll allow it." The blunt honesty of his answer took her breath away. "You want to court me? Seriously court me?" "Yes, madam, I do." His blue eyes never wavered from hers. "I know it hasn't been long, but I'm a man who knows his own mind. I like you, Maggie, very much, and I'd like the chance to see where this might lead." Maggie swallowed hard. "People will talk. People always talk. Question is, do we care more about their opinions than our own happiness?" Put that way, the answer seemed obvious, yet years of careful self-protection made Maggie hesitate. "I need to be sure, Xavier, that this isn't some passing fancy or charity." A flash of hurt crossed his face, quickly replaced by understanding. "Fair enough. How about this? I'll keep bringing you flowers every day, and we'll take the rest one step at a time. No rush, no pressure, just two people getting to know each other better." Relief and something warmer flooded through her. "I'd like that." He smiled, that crinkle-eyed smile that made her heart skip a beat, and picked up the reins again. "Then that's what we'll do." True to his word, Xavier continued to bring wildflowers every morning. Some days they were left on the boarding house porch, other days they appeared at the general store. Always fresh, always thoughtfully arranged, always accompanied by a brief note that Maggie collected in a small box beneath her bed. "Saw this purple one and thought of that dress you wore Sunday. These yellow ones match your laugh. Found these by the creek where we picnicked. The spot misses you." Their courtship progressed with careful deliberation. Xavier would often stop by the general store, ostensibly to purchase supplies but really to spend a few minutes talking with Maggie. On Wednesdays, her half-day off, they would walk together along the river or sit in the town square, gradually learning the contours of each other's lives. Maggie discovered that Xavier had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he was comfortable, that he could recite long passages of Shakespeare from memory, that he was unfailingly kind to children and animals. Xavier learned about Maggie's passion for books, her talent for mathematics that Mr. Hopkins relied on for the store's accounts, her secret dream of traveling to see the ocean someday. The townspeople's reactions varied. Some, like Mrs. Barton and Reverend Matthews, offered quiet support. Others, particularly Eleanor Prescott and her circle, made their disapproval clear with pointed remarks and conspicuous snubs. "Don't know what he sees in her," Maggie overheard Mrs. Prescott say to her friend outside the millinery shop. "A man that handsome could have any woman in town. Perhaps he likes having something substantial to hold on to," her friend replied with a malicious giggle. Maggie pretended not to hear, but later that night, alone in her room, the words returned to haunt her. Was that all she was to Xavier? A novelty. Something different to pass the time until he tired of her. The next day, a bouquet of particularly vibrant wildflowers awaited her at the store, along with a note. "Dinner tonight. I've something important to discuss." All day, anxiety gnawed at her. Was this the end? Had he finally realized, as she'd feared all along, that courting the town's overweight spinster was more trouble than it was worth? By the time evening came, Maggie had worked herself into such a state that Mrs. Winters noticed immediately. "Child, what's got you so flustered? You look like you're marching to your own hanging." Maggie smoothed her dress nervously. "Xavier wants to discuss something important tonight, I'm afraid." "That he's ending things." Mrs. Winters shook her head. "Foolish girl, that man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." "Whatever he wants to discuss, I doubt it's goodbye." Xavier arrived promptly at 6, wearing his good shirt and a slightly nervous expression that did nothing to calm Maggie's fears. They walked to the hotel restaurant in uncharacteristic silence, both seemingly lost in thought. Once they were seated and had ordered, Xavier cleared his throat. "Maggie, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart plummeted. Here it comes, she thought. Xavier reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been working hard on the house, fixing the roof, replacing some floorboards, getting the place ready to be a proper home." Confused, Maggie nodded. He'd mentioned his renovation projects before. "The thing is," he continued, "it's a big house for one person. Too big, really." Are you thinking of selling it?" Maggie asked, trying to understand where this was going. Xavier smiled, a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "No, Maggie, I'm thinking it needs a woman's touch. Your touch, specifically." The implication of his words slowly dawned on her, and she felt the blood drain from her face. "Xavier, are you?" "I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife," he said simply. "I know it hasn't been that long, but sometimes a man just knows when he's found the right woman." Maggie stared at him, speechless. Of all the things she had imagined him saying tonight, this was nowhere on the list. "If it's too soon, I understand," Xavier added quickly. "We can wait, court longer. I just wanted you to know my intentions. You want to marry me?" Maggie finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me?" Xavier's expression softened. "Yes, Maggie Foster, you, the woman who makes me smile just by existing, the woman whose kindness and strength amaze me daily, the woman I've fallen in love with. But I'm—" She gestured helplessly at herself. "Perfect," he finished for her. "Exactly as you are." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes. "People will talk. Let them." Xavier squeezed her hand. "Their opinions don't matter to me, only yours does. So what do you say, Maggie, will you marry me?" In that moment, Looking into his earnest blue eyes, Maggie made a decision. All her life, she had let fear of judgment dictate her choices, had made herself smaller in spirit even as her body remained large. She had accepted limits placed on her by others, had believed herself unworthy of the very happiness now being offered. No more. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, Xavier Cross, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the hills. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her fingers. "You've made me the happiest man in Texas, Maggie Foster." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church. Reverend Matthews officiated, beaming at the couple as they exchanged vows. Mrs. Winters wept openly in the front pew. Mr. Hopkins, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, stood as Maggie's witness. A surprising number of townspeople attended, their presence a quiet endorsement of the union. Conspicuously absent were Alina Prescott and her circle, a fact that bothered Maggie far less than she would have expected. Their disapproval seemed insignificant compared to the joy of the day. Xavier had indeed transformed the old Donovan place. What had once been a neglected homestead was now a welcoming home, with fresh paint, sturdy floors, and even curtains at the windows that he'd ordered specially from San Antonio's best dressmaker. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cross," he said that evening, lifting Maggie into his arms to carry her across the threshold despite her laughing protests that she was too heavy. "Xavier, you'll hurt yourself." "Nonsense," he replied, setting her down gently in the front room. "I'm stronger than I look." That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Maggie discovered what it truly meant to be desired for exactly who she was. Xavier's hands and lips mapped her body with reverence, finding beauty in every curve, every soft expanse that she had spent a lifetime being ashamed of. "You're perfect," he whispered against her skin. "Every inch of you." And for the first time in her life, Maggie believed it might be true. Morning came with golden light streaming through the bedroom window and the scent of coffee wafting from the kitchen. Maggie stretched languidly, feeling a pleasant soreness in muscles she hadn't known she possessed. The space beside her was empty, the sheets cool to the touch. Wrapping herself in a robe, she padded to the kitchen to find Xavier fully dressed, placing something on the table. When he saw her, he straightened with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Cross." The name still sent a thrill through her. "Good morning, husband." He stepped aside, revealing what he'd been arranging, a small vase of fresh wildflowers, vibrant against the simple wooden table. "You don't have to bring me flowers anymore," Maggie said, stepping into his embrace. "You've already won me." Xavier kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "I'll bring you flowers every day for the rest of our lives, Maggie Cross. That's a promise." Life as a rancher's wife suited Maggie far better than she could have imagined. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to manage a household, to ride horseback alongside Xavier as they inspected their growing herd of cattle. Her hands grew calloused from work, her skin tanned from the sun, but she had never felt more alive. The Crosses became known in the community for their hospitality and generosity. When drought struck the following year, they opened their well to neighbors whose water sources had dried up. When influenza swept through San Antonio that winter, Maggie made endless pots of broth, and Xavier delivered them to afflicted families. Gradually, even the most skeptical townspeople came to accept their union. Alina Prescott remained aloof, but her influence waned as others witnessed the genuine happiness and prosperity of the Cross household. A year after their wedding, Maggie discovered she was expecting their first child. Xavier's joy knew no bounds. He built a cradle with his own hands, expanded their vegetable garden, and fussed over Maggie until she laughingly banished him from the house for an afternoon of peace. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she told him, though his concern touched her deeply. Their son, Samuel, was born on a stormy night in March of 1880, a robust baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Xavier paced the porch while Mrs. Winters, who had come to serve as midwife, helped bring the child into the world. When at last he was allowed into the bedroom, Xavier approached the bed with uncharacteristic tentativeness, his eyes fixed on the bundle in Maggie's arms. "We have a son," she said, weary but radiant. "Come meet him." Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out a tentative finger to stroke the baby's cheek. "He's perfect," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "just like his mother." That night, after Mrs. Winters had gone to sleep in the spare room and Samuel was nestled in his cradle beside their bed, Xavier slipped out of the house. He returned a few minutes later, placing a small bundle on Maggie's bedside table. "Wildflowers, still wet with evening dew. You went out for flowers. Now?" Maggie asked incredulously. Xavier brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I promised you flowers every day for the rest of our lives. Today of all days, I couldn't break that promise." As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the Cross Ranch prospered. Xavier's careful management and hard work paid off. They expanded their herd, built a larger barn, added rooms to the house. Maggie started a small kitchen garden that grew to supply not only their family, but provide excess produce she could sell in town. Life wasn't without challenges. A particularly harsh winter in 1881 threatened their cattle. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights required legal intervention. But through it all, Xavier and Maggie faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. Their family expanded again in 1882 with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth, a quiet baby with her mother's thoughtful eyes and her father's determined chin. Samuel, now a rambunctious 2-year-old, approached his baby sister with solemn curiosity, eventually appointing himself her protector. Through sleepless nights, childhood illnesses, and the everyday chaos of raising young children, Xavier never once missed a day bringing Maggie flowers. Sometimes they were elaborate bouquets, other times a single blossom tucked behind her ear as they passed in the kitchen. Always they came with the same message: you are loved, you are cherished, you matter. In the summer of 1883, San Antonio held its first Founders' Day celebration, a grand affair with a parade, dancing, and a community picnic. The Crosses attended with their children, now 3 years and 1 year old, dressed in their Sunday best. As they mingled with townspeople, Maggie was approached by Alina Prescott, whose once cutting glances had softened somewhat over the years. "Mrs. Cross," she said with formal correctness. "Your children are lovely." "Thank you, Mrs. Prescott," Maggie replied, surprised by the overture. The older woman hesitated, then added, "Your husband. He's a good man. I was mistaken in my assessment. I hope you'll accept my apology for any unkindness in the past." Maggie studied the woman who had once been her most vocal critic. Time had etched lines around Alina's eyes, and there was a weariness in her bearing that spoke of private sorrows. "Of course," Maggie said gently. "That's all water under the bridge now." Relief flickered across Alina's face. "Thank you, and congratulations on your happiness. It seems you were wiser than many of us, after all." As Alina walked away, Xavier appeared at Maggie's side, Elizabeth dozing against his shoulder. "What was that about?" he asked, nodding toward the retreating figure. "Growth," Maggie replied thoughtfully. "For both of us, I think." That evening, as they drove home with 2 exhausted children sleeping in the back of the wagon, Maggie leaned against Xavier's solid shoulder and reflected on the journey that had brought them here from the lonely shop girl no one noticed to a woman surrounded by love, respected in her community, confident in her worth. "Penny for your thoughts," Xavier said, his arm warm around her waist. "I was just thinking about flowers," she replied, smiling up at him in the gathering dusk. How something so simple changed everything. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not the flowers, Maggie, you changed everything. The flowers were just my way of making sure you knew how special you are." As their wagon crested the final hill before their ranch came into view, the sturdy house with lamplight glowing in the windows, the barn where their livelihood grew, the fields where their children would run and play, Maggie felt a completeness she had never dared to hope for in those lonely days before Xavier Cross walked into the general store and saw her. The next morning, as always, she woke to find wildflowers on her bedside table and her husband's smile waiting for her when she opened her eyes. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, the words no less sincere for having been said countless times before. "Good morning, my love," she replied, reaching for him with absolute certainty that this man, this life, this love was exactly where she belonged. In the years that followed, the Cross family continued to grow and thrive. They welcomed a third child, another son named James, in 1885. Their ranch expanded, becoming one of the most prosperous in the county. Maggie, with Xavier's enthusiastic support, eventually opened the bookshop she had always dreamed of, a small but well-stocked establishment in San Antonio that quickly became a gathering place for the community. Through it all, through every season, through joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, Xavier kept his promise. Every single day, without fail, he brought Maggie Wildflowers a tangible reminder of the day he first noticed the woman that everyone else had overlooked, and the love that had blossomed between them against all expectations. And Maggie, who had once believed herself unworthy of such devotion, accepted each bouquet with the same joy as the first, knowing that true love sees beyond appearances to the beauty that lies within.